Hello there, we're back again. DF Direct Weekly number 187. Huge amount of news to wade through this week, and well, we haven't really got time to do it because we were supposed to be working on PlayStation 5 Pro. But joining me on the panel, first of all, Tom Morgan. Hi.
Hello, been a while. Good to be back as well after everything that's happened.
Whoa, okay,
so much has changed. Ominous. Like the PS5. So many things have changed in our working lives. So, glad to be back.
Okay, I'm glad you made that clarification. And also joining me is John Linneman.
Back once again with the ill behavior. It's it's time to talk about topics that aren't related to that other thing.
The other thing.
Absolutely. It was interesting. I put out the call to questions for supporters on Patreon and said, it's probably not worth asking us about PlayStation 5 Pro at this point because we have got the units, but we can't really talk about them. But still, the flood of questions continued. Anyway, let's move on. Let's crack on with the first news topic of the week. First news topic of the week, and it's somewhat extraordinary. Now, recently, of course, Sony's big live service game Concord didn't quite find the audience it was looking for. In fact, it flopped, and that was despite it being a pretty reasonable game. The game was withdrawn. We were expecting it to be retooled, possibly as a free-to-play venture, but astonishingly, Sony has decided just to cut its losses. The game is no more. It will never come back. More to the point, Firewalk Studios, the studio behind it, has essentially been laid off. They're gone. We've got a comment here from Herman Holst, the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment on the development side, that is. We've spent considerable time these past few months exploring all our options. After much thought, we have determined the best path forward is to permanently sunset the game and close the studios. I want to thank all of Firework for their craftsmanship, creative spirit, and dedication. Basically, Holst is saying that expectations weren't hit, targets weren't hit. The PlayStation maker will take the lessons learned from Concord and continue to advance our live service capabilities to deliver future growth in this area. Yeah, that isn't particularly great. I just want to talk about some of the comments made from Firewalk itself, because I think obviously, their achievements are worth discussing here. Basically, they were talking about beginning a startup during the global pandemic. Firewalk itself, founded in 2018, only entered full production in 2022 with Concord. They built a new customized next-generation FPS engine in Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5, delivering top-tier gameplay feel, beautiful worlds, and a performance 60 FPS technical experience on a stable and scalable backend on PS5 and PC to hundreds of thousands of players in our beta. Other things that they were talking about, handling acquisition and integration during all of that. And so they said that we took some risks along the way, marrying aspects of card battlers and fighting games with first-person shooters. And although some of these and other aspects of the IP didn't land as we hoped, the idea of putting new things into the world is critical to pushing the medium forward. The talent at Firewalk and the level of individual craft is truly world-class, and teams within Sony Interactive Entertainment and across the industry will be fortunate to work with them. And they're basically asking other developers to reach out for recruitment opportunities for their staff. John, did you foresee anything like this happening? I mean, we all kind of thought that the game would indeed move to free-to-play. And instead, basically, the rug's been pulled from under the developer, and Concord is no more, Firewalk is no more.
I was actually skeptical that it would return as free-to-play, to be honest, because I just don't see how you salvage something like this when the public reaction is that negative, right? Like, what the whole free-to-play model depends on people liking things about the game, like the characters and like certain things with the visual design. Like, people get excited for that stuff and they spend money on digital goods, and that's essentially how free-to-play model can support a game like this, right? If nobody liked anything about it in terms of characters and whatnot, like, what do you do? right? Like the core game is actually quite solid, but the areas that needed to be appealing to a wider audience to make it viable as free to play aren't there. So
well, ultimately, they made a game that's very similar to free-to-play alternatives, and you had to pay $40 for
Correct.
it, which I would consider problematic.
Oh yeah, that was certainly one of the biggest issues, but I still think to make it also successful as free to play, you need to be appealing in certain key areas, which this game really was not.
Right.
So I can't say I'm all that surprised by what happened here. It is obviously unfortunate for them. They made a competent game that just doesn't really have an audience right now. And I think that's kind of, this just shows that inherent risk in trying to get into these service model games, because fundamentally, if it's a success, you can stand to make a lot of money. But if it's not, like, what do you do? Like, if it's a failure, you can't, unlike a single player game, like it needs people working on it in order to survive, right? You have to continue to invest money in it to keep it going. And if you look at the maths and it's like, well, we have to spend this amount of money to keep it running, but we're only forecasting X amount, which is less than that coming in, then realistically you can't keep it running and there's nothing you can do. And
there have been games that have launched in
Sure.
a poor state and have come back.
Sure, you look at like Final Fantasy 14, right? That's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
But Final Fantasy 14 is very appealing. Like, people weren't, the initial version failed not because it wasn't an appealing concept, but because like the game itself was quite broken and there was like major faults in it. And that's what I'm saying. It's like the core fundamental design has to be appealing to a large enough audience to be viable. And this one was not, is what I'm saying. And that's why I don't think that free to play would have worked, because it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that thing. Like, clearly the audience did not like what they saw. They rejected it. So unless they retooled everything about the art direction and the characters, I just don't see how you relaunch this thing into a world where people are willing to embrace it. Because obviously free to play doesn't actually mean it's free. It means you have to, in order to survive, people have to spend money on the game, microtransactions and the like, cosmetics. And who's going to spend cosmetics money on characters they don't like?
Okay, Tom, you played it, right? You did some coverage back in the day for us. I mean, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I played the beta and I thought it was fun. It was good. It was a good time, but it was clearly derivative, and I wonder why they conceived of it in the first place. Like, I'm pretty sure the hook going into it was, and when it was announced in those early sort of reveals, there was a very character driven sort of focus for those early like CG reveals. And I think that was where they were going. They wanted to make these characters stars in the way Overwatch propelled its cast of characters as kind of stars. But you can't. That was like a phenomenon. Like Overwatch and what happened with that cast of characters was sort of a once in a decade sort of thing. They can't bottle lightning like that, and nobody ended up liking the characters. And what John and I played in the beta when we covered it was just a perfectly decent game, very decent, but very forgettable as well. Like I wanted to like it. I always go into these things, giving it the benefit of the doubt, try to cast aside cynicism. The thought of we've played all this before. And it came out around the same time as Marvel Rivals as well, another Unreal Overwatch style shooter, and that had a bit more going for it in terms of it wasn't as visually lush as Concord, but it had more inventive ideas going about it in integrating Marvel characters. So it's kind of an interesting companion review to do around the same time. So yeah, I'm sad that it's happened, and the only thing I could say is I hope there's a silver lining in that all the accomplishments that Firewalk have listed in their sort of send-off letter there might be recycled or reused. The infrastructure they've found in the PS5 and PC integration, some of the talent that worked on it will go on to do bigger, better things, hopefully, with this as a springboard. Honestly, that's the best I could hope for it. And it is sad because like John mentioned, there's no way to access a free-to-play game like this, of this nature. It will live on in people's minds as maybe a cult favorite in some way, if people liked it. Some small group of people really loved it. But beyond that, there's no way to access it, as might have been possible in like previous generations where things weren't so online focused.
Okay, so sort of like Lawbreakers 2.0 almost, in a sense.
It survived less than that,
say.
though. That's the thing.
Well, I got this supporter question from Alan from the Discord,
The Alan.
legendary Alan. There is only one. Hi, DF team. Apparently, Concord cost $400 million! Exclamation point. I think that is.
I think that is false.
Figure is
The people that know that number would not have been talking about that number. I think that's massive overestimation.
I think it's probably an overestimation.
It's along with the whole in development for 8 years comment, which is also nonsense.
However, as Alan says, that's a huge write-off for Sony. Well, it's going to be a write-off. However, it's not going to be a cheap game. And they've now closed Firewalk. I hope some of the developers are able to move to Sucker Punch that are in the same area. Where does this leave Sony and their live service ambitions? Bungie is in a shambles. A Marathon doesn't really seem all that appealing, in my opinion. Must be close to $5 billion combined cost for Firewalk, Concord, and Bungie Marathon. And technology. But has this spending spree just been a waste of money? Well, Alan has actually missed out the whole Naughty Dog debacle with the Last of Us multiplayer game there.
Yeah.
Shambles, John, is it?
Probably not shambles, but they certainly spent more money on things that they probably should not have. And I understand that I'm famously not a fan of live service games, but I know a lot of people that love them. And I see the appeal from a business of wanting to go for that stuff. And Sony obviously knows that they were weak in that area. So it makes sense to invest in studios that kind of have more experience there. It just isn't working so far. It's fascinating that Herman Holst seems to be driving this so much, considering that he comes from a background of Guerrilla Games, whose biggest success is entirely single player. Right? Like Killzone had multiplayer, but it wasn't nearly as successful. Horizon is like a fully single player focused series, and that's where they found success. That's what Sony's known for. That's what most PlayStation fans seem to want. Outside of, not this, there is obviously a group of PlayStation fans playing multiplayer games. Call of Duty's huge on there, things like that. Fortnite, of course, is being played. And I guess they just wanted a piece of that pie, and it's not really feasible in this case. The Bungie situation is certainly weird, though, in terms of where they're at right now. And it's starting to feel, the thing about Destiny when it came out did actually feel very fresh, and it was very appealing. I even liked Destiny a lot. But now we're at that part where making these types of service games, it feels entirely like corporate driven. And unless you show a vision of something that's really exciting to players, it seems pretty tough to capture them again.
Right.
So, and like Marathon is such a waste of an IP. Like, why would you bring back that IP only to use it on something that fans of Marathon, however many there are left, really would have so little interest in? Like, you may as well just call it something else. And I never understood the whole Marathon decision. But I mean, Bungie and their dead boxed games sort of attitude, they don't seem like the leadership there does not respect or care about single player games anymore, it seems. So
well, we have got Helldivers 2, of course, which did do extremely well. I guess I don't know what the next big project's going to be. I mean, the Horizon multiplayer game is a thing, isn't it? It's just deeply sad, but it does look as though the venture overall into the sort of live service arena can't really be seen as anything other than a failure. And it kind of demonstrates to me also how entrenched attitudes are when it comes to gaming. Because you talked last week about the forever games, and they are indeed forever. They ain't going anywhere. So the concept of breaking into that is just really, really difficult.
Exactly. I guess the key here, the thing that doesn't worry me too much, is that clearly they also realize that single player is still important. Most of their single player focused studios are continuing to work on games in that vein. Naughty Dog did have multiplayer aspirations, and they've done it before, but clearly they decided live service was not for them, and they were allowed to do that, which I think is key. And I think we haven't seen that much new from a lot of these big studios just because they released a lot of their games not within the last 4 years or so, and these things take a long time to make. So I don't think they're largely not forcing their single player driven studios to make multiplayer games. They just invested in other studios to do it, which I think is probably the right way to do it. They weren't wrong to try. It's not panning out clearly yet, but if they even have one big success, I guess they could argue it might be worth it, but we'll see.
Okay. Any final thoughts on this one, Tom?
I think they will eventually get there if they keep cracking a lot of eggs to make the omelette there. But it's taking a lot of sacrifice, a lot more than I expected, given the number of projects and failures. I was especially looking forward to The Last of Us Part 2's multiplayer, being a big fan of the original's faction mode. I've spent hundreds of hours on that, and so yeah, hugely very disappointed to see that go away for Naughty Dog. I'm hoping that they don't. Again, I hope they find some way to recycle their talent and the learnings from that effort, at least behind the scenes, and it'll manifest in some other way in another game somehow.
What was it? The Last of Us Part 2 that had factions? It was Last Part 1, wasn't it?
It was 1, then
the original.
The original, and then 2. They had big plans to expand the concept, make it sort of its own entity. Really,
they shouldn't have done that. They should have just stuck with. I mean, I think if they had delivered factions multiplayer again with a higher fidelity, people would have been happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now you got nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all very, very strange. I really hope for the best for the Firewalk guys and girls. This is just really, really...
Yeah, I know.
Depressing. What can I say?
This is the thing that bothers me about this live service push, is because like they always say, corporates like, if you try 15 games and one becomes a Fortnite, then it was quote unquote worth it. But you've sacrificed so many people to get there. Like you're playing with people's livelihoods here. Like these developers are suffering for this like corporate like this reach towards this big live service push, and I just don't like that. That's the side of it that really bothers me.
Absolutely. I haven't really got much to add to that, but man, this news knocked me for 6. So I just can't quite get my head around it. With that, let's move on. Okay, on to happier news here. Recently, there was a press event for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Microsoft's big game for December. I've seen trailers, little else. But Tom, you actually went to a press event. I believe you went hands-on with the game, did you not?
Yes, I had to go on the PC version. Well, it was it was a fairly extensive demo, actually. It's sort of a 3-parter. And there's, people's previews and are out already. And for DF coverage, we couldn't really do too much with it in terms of a dedicated video because we couldn't get our own capture. But we do have B-roll, which I've supplied Oliver here. Interesting demo. Machine Games at the helm. The setting is, we're all familiar with where it is. It's between the first and third films, Raiders, and what was the third film in the Indiana Jones?
Last Crusade.
Last
Crusade, yeah. So we're going back to 1930s, and Machine Games have done a great job of recreating so much of that world, I think. That's the number one positive I will say about it. It's an adventure game. It's not in the tradition of what they've worked on in previous years, a shooter or FPS necessarily. It's really an adventure game in first person, And with that comes a kind of, it's closer to Hitman, I'd say, than most of their earlier output, in that you're depending on finding clues, you're, going in stealth, you're swapping clothes with like Nazi soldiers and other people around, and trying to get to the sort of mission objective that way, rather than going guns blazing. And this game tends to be quite punitive if you do go all guns blazing as well. So it's generally not advised. I played on a PC. There was no expenses spared on that. It was I've got what was listed here. It was an i9, 4900K RTX 4090. They pretty much whacked all the settings up to maximum or supreme, as they call it in their settings menu parlance. And the only thing I could not see, and they were very specific about this, they did not want us to see path tracing enabled. The build was still work in progress, very much so, and they just said there's some features that are not working, and there were some bugs and glitches from it being an early build as well. The game is out on the 9th of December, so there's a bit of time to go, but it is, I was impressed. It was shaping up quite nicely. There were a few bugs and oddities here and there, but I think the highlight for me was really going back to that thing of being very authentic to the films. You've got 3 specific areas. There's the museum that Indiana Jones works at with his sort of tie and collar, and every single artifact that they've collected at the museum is all beautifully exhibited, and the materials and every small detail in these like urns and sculptures is like chiseled out so nicely by the developer here, and it shines. Then you move to a second stage, which is the Vatican, sort of a castle area, and you've got these great like cobblestone surfaces, dark lighting, lots of spotlights shining in different directions that cast shadows. And here you really get a sense of the stealth part of the game and how to proceed very, very gradually through the stage and not alert attention from the guards. Great AI usage, and there's a real game building around that concept that works. And the third bit was in Egypt, Gizeh, which puts you right near the Nile, near the pyramids. And this is where it really introduces a new style of gameplay to machine games, which is a completely open format. You're free to go in any direction and conquer objectives in any way you choose. There's about 5 or 6 areas. You're hunting for clues, you're swapping costumes with people you encounter, and it's a real departure from what we're used to from that studio. It's a very big open world concept area that kind of pays off if you like look close and explore a bit. So very very well executed, I think, so far. But I think the only other thing I've got to say is that the global illumination in this game is top tier. Really, I'm pretty sure I'm fairly sure they're using some ray tracing. We'll have to see. It's not the path tracing option, but it is sort of a ray traced approach. And I'm wondering if that'll make it to the consoles as well, since it seems so entrenched in the game's visual design. It's a really gorgeous looking sort of outfit overall, I think.
Interesting. I've got a question for you, which is, I'm kind of seeing that there's a lot of DNA from the movies in here, but the movies also had like pretty spectacular set pieces.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of cycling through the footage here. I'm not seeing any of that so far. Is it actually quite a slower paced game?
Quite slow paced, but that could be due to the sample that they showed us.
Right.
Like
okay.
in some of the, might have been Gamescom or E3 trailers, they showed some more set piecey moments. We're not seeing anything quite like Uncharted set pieces where it's in game, sort of very memorable, like climbing up through a bus on the side of a cliffside or what have you. But yeah, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. It does seem quite slow and methodical in terms of the general gameplay beats of it. It was a surprise to me because I was expecting a little bit more, action, but it may build up to that. It may climax to that.
Okay, John, you're taking a look at this footage, right? Any thoughts?
Oh yeah, I'm looking at this. I'm as a big fan of machine games, and before that, Starbreeze. To me, I see a lot of this feels like sort of an evolution of what they did back in the day with the Riddick games, which also sort of had this more open-ended stealth approach. There was definitely scenes where you're essentially free to wander around the prison, talk to people, and complete objectives in a slightly different way. This just seems like a bigger take on that, infused with Indiana Jones. And as a fan of this series, I'm very excited by that. I was especially impressed with I feel like the dialogue, the voice acting, everything, it actually very successfully nails the feel of Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, right? Like, he's like, it's not him, obviously, you can tell it's not, but it sounds suitably like what you think of Indiana Jones or Harrison
Troy
Ford
Baker
in the 80s, right? Yeah, that's right. Troy Baker. He's doing it. Doesn't sound like typical Troy Baker.
No,
which is to say, he's just showing off his range there, and it really works. I'm happy with that. I am curious. I think this was a good idea, rather than trying to make this like an Uncharted style game, because Uncharted always got compared to Indiana Jones. I'm not sure that machine games could really match the spectacle of those types of scenes that Naughty Dog does, just because the sheer cost of making that stuff, the level that you have to hit, it doesn't really make sense to be directly compared to that. And instead, they've leveraged what they do very well and very differently than what something like Naughty Dog does. And I think that's going to pay off handsomely here with something that looks really, really interesting and fun. I mean, this is high on my list of excitement for titles.
Yeah, absolutely. It's playing to their own strengths.
Exactly.
And a lot of the staff on the Riddick game are actually returning for this, from what I've been reading around. So, yeah, that DNA is all over it. They've really. I appreciate bold steps like this. I don't think they. They could easily fit the mold of an Uncharted or the new rebooted Tomb Raider style games, but they've really gone for a different route, and I think they've picked apart what makes the films tick and how those films sort of play out. And it really isn't like an action-packed roller coaster. It's a little bit, there's a lot of looking for clues inside like old tombs and things like that. So there's a couple of nice touches in here as well, though. Like they've got a HUD basically that's built in game. Like when you look down at your map, you're actually looking down at a map down, and you see yourself as a cursor walking around this in-game sort of object, and then you look up again and it's gone. Stuff like that I think works really well. There's a lot of great stuff in this. I'm looking forward to seeing it come out.
It's also a glimpse at modern id Tech, right? Since they've developed this alongside id Software, as id Software continues to work on Doom: The Dark Ages. So presumably they are indeed leveraging the latest in id Tech here, though with their own flavor. So that's always exciting to see, though obviously very different sort of game.
Yeah. Might be interesting to just rattle off a few things that were in the settings menu. You're getting upscaling with native TAA and DLSS in there, super resolution, DLSS super resolutions in there, DLSS reconstruction, frame gen, and there's two settings in there for static resolution scaling and dynamic resolution scaling. So there is some good flexibility in there, but there was no sign of FSR or XCSS or anything like that. Huh. But again, early build as well, so they could come around.
It may well be the case that for a software-based solution, id and machine games may simply be quite happy with their own software-based solution.
Which traditionally was quite good.
Yeah, so, just have to wait and see there. But yeah, certainly looking really pretty fantastic here. I'm looking forward to seeing the final game. And it is kind of nice / surprising that it isn't just like a first-person Uncharted, because, Uncharted's kind of been done at this point. So, to see something different and hopefully something a little more fresh. So, yeah, interesting stuff. The full path tracing, though, obviously,
Yeah,
Alex is going to be all over that.
same.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, John?
I guess one thing I was trying to maybe you could. It's hard to tell from this footage, but I'm seeing essentially virtually zero pop in, which made me wonder if they're using some sort of like virtualized geometry system, something kind of like a nanite, or what Remedy was doing with Alan Wake and their engine. You know what I mean? Like, did you actually notice like visible pop in or LODs happening? So
Not so much.
I'm really
No,
not seeing anything in this footage. That huge, the Egyptian area,
Yeah, I was just looking at that.
right? Like it's very, very geometrically dense, yet there's no like visible like LOD popping, which is
the only thing
promising.
there was no pop in, well, very visible pop in of geometry, but there was shadow stuff. Shadow,
Yeah.
sort of. It was obviously popping in and filtering quite close.
To just typical cascaded shadow maps.
Yeah, it was, and
Totally
it was
different
especially noticeable around the museum area at the start. But hey, it was still quite an early build as well.
Giza.
Okay.
I like it. I like how you say Giza. I'm just thinking of a couple of Gizas strolling in to get a
Yep.
kebab after a night of drinking.
A what?
What?
K-Bob.
I just assumed that's the British way to say kebab.
No, it's a good
Would you care to? Oh, okay. So you've enlightened me.
Okay,
It just felt natural.
I do want a K-Bob, though.
I would love a kebab.
Whatever those are,
Yeah,
kebab,
whatever.
kebab.
I'm game for it. Okay, so Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I guess it's going to be the last big game that we're going to be covering this year in terms of the AAA fare, and we'll be all
yeah.
over it.
Big time.
But with that, let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so obviously there's a lot going on at Digital Foundry at the moment, and we were hoping to do a review for Mario and Luigi Brothership. We don't want to leave the Nintendo Switch behind. The review embargo, rather the preview embargo is up. The review embargo, I think it's pretty imminent. But Tom, you've taken a look at this, and actually the reason we're covering it is, John, you also took a look at it. And
Yes.
that there are concerns.
Correct.
Hmm.
Who wants to take point on this one? Tom?
Yeah, sure. I had about an hour and a half with the game, and it was interesting. Well, I think the first point is that it runs at 30 with uneven frame pacing, but the setup is that Mario and Luigi find themselves on this mysterious island. It's a sort of mysterious land that needs help, and it's kind of floating between different islands. And there's an interesting dynamic in this game where you have a map in the top left corner where you're floating between them, and at certain points in real time, it'll become close enough to an island that you can shoot off via a cannon to land on that new location. So it's an interesting way to mix up where you can explore and what sort of areas what biomes, I guess, you can check out. Nice cel-shaded style, and it's built on Unreal Engine 4, which seems to be the direction that Nintendo are increasingly going in these days. I think we might see a bit more of this. But yeah, it's by a developer, Acquire, at the helm for this, who did Octopath Traveler 1 and 2, or assisted on those games with Square Enix.
Do you know if you go back further though, what did they do on the PlayStation, Tom?
Way of the Samurai.
No, well, before that,
Before that, I'm not sure.
Tenchu, the Tenchu
of
series.
course. Yes, I
Man,
remember that.
I would love to see a new installment in that.
Yeah, I love Tenchu.
Those are
Tenchu
great,
2.
right?
Yeah, so they've come a long way, but I guess they're really into their Unreal Engine based games these days, and this has the same problem, I guess, as Octopath Traveler on console, 30 FPS, uneven frame pacing, and there are some games we can maybe get away with a little bit of that, but it's a constant problem. And with a game of this style, where you're top down, running around, jumping, oh my god, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It really does. And it drops under as well. It drops under 30 during cutscenes. So it seems like an ill-judged move, or at least the way they've implemented this game plan, it's not been judged well. I did look at resolutions as well. It's 900p on Switch docked and just regular 720p while portable. So that's fine, but it's just really the frame rate side that's a bit of a disappointment, I think.
Okay. John, thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly what stuck out to me when I played a friend's copy. Was the bad frame pacing or incorrect frame pacing. And as you say, the Switch versions of the Octopath games, which were also capped at 30, had exactly the same problem. But what's worse here is that there's also the frame rate drops and then just the loading times. That was the real kicker for me. Like when you get into a battle, you know, it takes a little bit to transition, but it's not too bad. But when you finish the battle, it actually cuts to like a black loading screen. Then it like shows like gameplay tips, which just feels cheap and pulls you out of the action. It just sits there for like 10 seconds loading while showing you tips just when you finished a battle. And that absolutely destroys the momentum, I think. And as a borderline ruins the game, I would say, or that's just not pleasant. It's like in an RPG, you're getting into battles all the time, right? Imagine every time you get into a battle, you've got this like loading at the beginning, but then an equally long loading screen after the battle before you get back to the map. And it happens a lot. It sucks.
Yeah, it really does.
I mean, my opinion is based solely on the footage that you've provided here, Tom. And I don't know. It just kind of looks a little basic for 30 FPS games compared to some of the stuff that Nintendo has done itself. And I'm wondering, you know, thinking about this, because it's clear that Nintendo is kind of diversifying its efforts and bringing in more third-party studios to handle first-party properties. And I think the results have kind of like been a bit of a mixed bag so far. So, you know, there was always this reputation that a first-party Nintendo game would, you know, essentially be bulletproof. You could almost buy it without having to see any reviews and stuff. But I think that's kind of changed now. You definitely have to take a look at the reviews to see, you know, how well it's going to run. You know, that's slightly troubling. Thoughts, John?
Yeah, man, this is a really just a weird situation. I will say though that some of the partnerships Nintendo's formed have turned out great. Like with what they did with Mercury Steam, for instance. Like you look at Metroid Dread, and it's like their own engine, just this beautiful, silky smooth 60 FPS most of the time, beautiful visuals. So like it still works. They had an almost Retro Studios effect on Mercury Steam, essentially helping them learn to make better games. And I would say they were very successful in that. I think Acquire themselves has a pretty good track record though. But when it comes to just utilizing tech, I'm consistently baffled by studios that miss these things, like the frame pacing issues. Unless there's a technical reason why it occurs. For instance, Doom Eternal and Doom on the Switch, panic button due to how those games work and how it was pushing the Switch in certain ways. Like there was a certain amount of frame time inconsistency that worked its way into the game that they just realistically could not clean up. But they were fully aware of it. Where here, this is usually a case of like there's an issue with the default Unreal frame rate cap, and the developer just enables that cap without really understanding that it doesn't work right, and there's other ways to do this. As we know, it's similar on the PlayStation side, right? Where if you use Sony's VSync call to cap your frame rate, it'll do it perfectly paced. Whereas if you just utilize whatever the engine provides, in many cases, it does not do a good job. So we're never getting rid of this.
No,
I was just thinking about the 31.5 frames per second cap in Sonic Generations on Switch.
Oh my god!
Did you see, Rich? The modders went in there and removed the cap, and even on a non-overclocked Switch, they're able to get 60 FPS in Sonic Generations.
Oh,
right.
So it's just like, what are you even doing, guys? Like Sega, why did you put that cap in there? Like the game does actually run at 60. The shadow portion, no, but Sonic Generations itself, yes. It's baffling.
Do you think that might be the reason that, they wanted consistency?
Because every other last gen version is 60 FPS in Sonic Generations, but 30 in the Shadow portion, right? So like, why not just take that same? I'm baffled by it. It really is confusing to me. But yeah, the 31 FPS, 31.5 FPS cap is just boneheaded. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's a massive self-own, isn't it?
Isn't it? An own goal, as you might say.
Don't you have own goals in America?
I mean, I guess.
In American football?
Not. I mean, that would be almost impossible to happen in American football, just due to the way it works, right?
Yeah.
You have to carry the ball through the goal, unless they get confused and run the wrong way.
That'd be awesome. I want to see this.
Yeah, the
Straight
quarterback
onto
throws the
YouTube.
ball to him and he just turns around and runs the other. I don't want to get tackled.
Must have happened once in history.
It's up there with that time somebody got the $100 question wrong on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and they were sort of like 100% all in on their answer. It was completely wrong.
I've seen a few of those.
Okay, well, final thoughts on the game, Tom. Would you recommend it? I mean, we're probably not going to be doing a review as such, so I mean, you've only had a very short time with it, I guess. But I guess I'm asking what your final impressions are.
Yeah, I'm disappointed, but there is a good game underneath it, as ever with the, a Nintendo. Well, it would have been sort of assisted by Nintendo, who might have aided them in planning the game concept and working with Acquire on that. I think the game idea is fantastic. Like, it's an extension of the Mario RPG idea of going into battles and then using like real-time inputs to extend your attacks. And there's a lot of inventiveness in the humor of the game. It's a beautiful world that you're exploring. It's just the choppiness that goes with it that's a bit of a shame. And I don't want to I don't want to rule it out completely as a game that shouldn't be revisited down the line on, say, future Nintendo hardware. Maybe it'll improve there, but it's for Switch. It does seem a bit out of its depth, with Unreal Engine as kind of like the foundation on which it's built. And they had to rely on that 30 FPS cap, and as a result, we've got this problem as well.
They'd have to do. It would have to be a patch. It couldn't do back compat if they've got a frame rate cap on there.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Okay. Well, we're actually going to have a switch in the panel now because Tom's got to go and finish his Call of Duty video. So, thanks for everything on this one, Tom.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.
It was good to have you, Tom.
Okay, the panel has rotated. Tom has gone back to his Call of Duty project, and joining us, Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, I'm not working on Call of Duty. I'm working on Red Dead Redemption PC. A lot of fun there.
I like how,
Good
Rich,
stuff.
you just insinuated that you sent Tom back to the Call of Duty lines.
Every year, there's a new haul.
He volunteers for it. He volunteers for it. He loves it. Anyway, Alex, we're here to talk about Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered on PC. Now, we didn't actually get to see the game on PC until launch, which is kind of strange because we saw the PS5 version like 2 weeks earlier. However, going into this one, I was thinking, well, all of the hard work has been done already for Horizon Forbidden West. Nixis know what they're doing. PC versions should be pretty good, therefore. And I would like you to validate that, please.
I'll validate it off the, just normally validate it. Yeah, sure. It is a Nixie's port, so it's going to have a lot of the Nixie stuff, and it is technologically extremely similar to Horizon Forbidden West. And the menu system, the launcher, all the options are basically everything you saw in Horizon Forbidden West, except now there's also a anti-lag 2 option you can select, which is new to my knowledge.
Interesting.
But yeah, so I wanted to check out the game really briefly on a Ryzen 5 3600 RTX 4060 PC. because it's kind of our console analog PC, as well as it throws up a number of bottlenecks occasionally with regards to the CPU, as well as with 8 gigabyte GPU VRAM there. So I loaded it up, and there's a couple of things that are slightly different than Horizon Forbidden West. Namely, there seems to be an unskippable cutscene at the beginning, just like there was originally back in the day when the original port launched all those years ago. How long ago it was, I don't remember. But during that time, there's actually a shader pre-compilation sequence that occurs. One thing that I do find a little bit annoying, though, about the pre-rendered sequences in the game is they are running at 30 FPS. Quality of them isn't so great, and I don't think the playback is perfect as well. I think this is something we talked about. Even John might have talked about it a bit in his video. Just like they don't look as good as the gameplay, which runs at 60. And it especially even on, like, I was just targeting 1440p on this machine, using the high settings I also included the parallax occlusion mapping. And the high settings are very similar to those that are found on the PlayStation 5's performance mode, as I found back in my review back then, except the default now on PC for high includes something like 16 times anisotropic filtering, which it never used to do, actually. So they've changed what the high preset is. But yeah, those intro, like, FMV cutscenes that are found all throughout the first chapter, as well, I think during chapter transitions usually, they don't look too great, and they don't run too great, and they're not so awesome. But at least when you get into gameplay there, or at least the initial opening cutscenes, there's a couple things that I already noticed that are kind of typical Nixie's port stuff, but they're also typical to Horizon games, and specifically the first one. Like, some of the transitions between the various camera cuts are a little awkward. That's still in there to a good degree. Yeah. Also, the way dynamic resolution scaling works in the current Nixie's games, at least as far as I could tell, is that you set dynamic resolution scaling. Like, for example, I did 1440p DLSS dynamic resolution scaling for 60 FPS, and the upper bounds always seems to be 1440p native, and that is a high resolution. So sometimes when it'll end one camera cut to another, there'll be a period of dropped frames that, there's always like a kind of a dropped frame in between camera cuts, but there's also sometimes a number of them after a camera cut as dynamic resolution switches to something quite a bit lower usually. And then you can find that also happening in the gameplay. Like, if you just twist the camera really quickly, you'll often see just like a sputtering, like of a couple drop frames here or there down to like 58 FPS for a second. Obviously on a VRR display, this doesn't really matter too much, but one thing I've been trying to argue for in the last couple of years with Nixie Sports is that I wish there was a bit more control over dynamic resolution, because currently it's goes up to a resolution that is just your output resolution, and there's no control over how aggressive it is. And I think it would be great to allow people to choose how high res it goes as well as how aggressive it is, because honestly, quality mode DLSS already looks really good. There's almost no reason to let it float above that unless you really want it. So that's one thing I really wish they had. But otherwise, GPU limited in game, primarily running around the game world, just as, here and there, a couple of drop frames, primarily just from the GPU when I move the camera too quickly, or something big would happen on screen really quickly, which would cause like one tiny little VSync frame drop. Nothing bad at all. Really great for VRR. Another thing that I noticed is that the game starts with the sharpening slider, which applies to DLSS as well here. Just applies to everything, set to like 5 out of 10. And I thought the game looked a bit crunchy at 1440p, so turning that down is something I would maybe recommend to people in the audience. Just looked a little bit crunchy on like a desktop monitor distance. One thing that I also wanted to talk about is that they describe it in their blog. I can't remember if John talked about it in his video, but they added a lot more just random NPCs into areas. Yep. They definitely have a CPU burden. And if you go, for example, I was running towards the first little town in the prologue area of the game, and I noticed like a frame drop as I was running towards the town, or as I got near the town. I was like, GPU seems fine here. I loaded up the game again, same settings, but just ultra low resolution, like ridiculously low resolution to be CPU bottlenecked on the RTX 4060. And indeed, if you get into that town, that first little town, I think it's called like Mother's Heart or something like that. I forget the name of the town. But yeah, it's CPU limited on Ryzen 5 3600 below 60 FPS with slightly unstable frame times. They're not bad frame times, but they're a little bit more unstable than the rest of the world. And just running around, it's like in the 50s there. And just running around the game world, I did notice in the prologue area that the Ryzen 5 3600 on these high settings is just above 60 FPS quite often. You wouldn't notice it, obviously, with good frame capping or with VSync usually, but it's like just there sometimes, like 70, 80 at the most, but sometimes it's like right at 60, which is pretty intense because at its heart, this is a PS4 game, but they have now added so much, I guess that's NPC density, as well as just greater density overall, that the game now is actually quite a CPU challenge, I would argue, in comparison to what it used to be.
I'd be curious to see Meridian on there on the PC performance, because I actually ran out of time, but I actually looked at this where in the original, when you enter Meridian, there's that large bridge. It's pretty much empty. There's like a couple guards patrolling. There's basically nothing happening. Whereas in the new version, there's like dozens of NPCs now like doing stuff. Right. And you get into the city and it's basically they ramped up the number of NPCs in the scene. So everything is way more congested and busier. It does not drop below 60 on the PS5, but I'm wondering if on that CPU, if you'd be struggling a little bit.
I mean,
more
I could just grab a save after this and do a really quick test, and you may be seeing it here, and we may be seeing this, but I would have based upon the fact that this smaller little town area had some views that were in the 50s. I would imagine the Ryzen 5 3600 is suffering similarly there, if not worse, based upon the fact that Meridian's, I think, the largest city in the game. Actually, here's Alex with some editing room shenanigans. I did load up the game with a later save from Meridian, and there, when running to the city, I noticed some strange performance actually happening, some bad performance on the Ryzen 5 3600 when CPU limited here at this ultra low resolution. Basically, running in, it goes below 60 rather noticeably, and it kind of moved the frame rate down there in a way I didn't really expect. I did expect lower frame rates, but not like this. And the behavior is essentially, as we can see here, sitting still above 60 FPS, completely fine. Start moving the camera through Meridian in just kind of a slightly more erratic way. Completely CPU limited, is dropping down into the 40s and 30s. Camera goes steady again, and we're above 60 FPS. And this behavior is what I noticed on the Ryzen 5 3600 while in Meridian here. It really didn't show up earlier in the game to such an intense degree, but in the city, definitely does. Basically, for some reason, moving the camera, even while staying mainly in the exact same place, really dips the performance hard on the CPU, doubling the load. Just even though I'm more or less staying in the same place, it's just the camera's moving. So pretty bad performance there on the Ryzen 5 3600, and let's hope and see if Nixies can do anything about that. Maybe not. Overall, though, I would say it is a great effort. I didn't think there were any really big problems. There are some things I didn't get to test because of the amount of time. I know one thing I've talked about in the past is like camera movement when combined with things like DLSS 3 isn't always perfect in Nixies games.
All right.
I did not get to test that, but maybe people in the audience have. This is just kind of like me just dipping my feet into the water here. But my impressions are very positive. I found it better looking than the original game, better looking than the original PC release. I liked that Aloy's head when she's a child is like normal sized. Something I immediately noticed. Our head seemed a little bit smaller. I think it's a great looking game now. And yeah, the LOD also just felt better too. Like in the first game, you'd like run forward on like paths, and you could notice like the ground deforming ahead of you. And I didn't really notice that so much here. So they definitely push things up.
Smaller heads. It's the kind of technical critique that millions come to Digital Foundry.
That's why I'm here.
It sounds pretty good, and I guess it finally puts a full stop at the end of a story that began with some pretty sorry performance on PC. That original port was kind of lashed into shape by Nixis, but this is kind of like the way forward, really. And I think the same $10 upgrade applies.
Yes, it does. It does.
Versus the original.
That's cool.
Okay, so yeah, that's pretty fantastic. Okay, well, Horizon, it's good. Hurrah! Let's move on. Okay, so I was talking to John about this earlier in the week, and he came up with a phrase that I've written down and intend to use further in conversation. Disaster remaster.
Yes.
We see them occasionally. We've got a couple on the docket. Let's talk about them. Which one should we tackle first? Shadows of the Damned, John?
Yeah, that one fits the bill, I would say,
right.
In this case. And maybe disaster remaster is a little harsh in this case. Only a little bit, though. So this is obviously a Grasshopper manufactured game. This was the awesome collaboration between Suda51, Shinji Mikami, and Akira Yamaoka for the music. Which is awesome. It's a very fun and funny sort of shooter that takes place like in the demon realm. And of course, there's the great turret sequence where demons taste your big boner for, about 10 minutes.
I remember this.
Which is always enjoyable. Problem is, this game was limited to Xbox 360 and the PS Triple. It was Unreal Engine 3. It looks very Unreal Engine 3. To the point where you're like, wow, this really resembles those really early demos in some ways. And it was backwards compatible on modern Xbox consoles, but it was still limited to its original resolution at 30 frames per second. So I was very pleased to see that they decided to remaster this on all the modern platforms, as well as the PC. Now, in this case, we did not receive review code. I bought a copy on PS5 just because I wanted to play it again myself. And I quickly discovered that I have possibly made a mistake. So I don't know how the other versions fare. But on PS5, it has issues. So first of all, it does run. It seems that they've ported it to Unreal Engine 5. This is what people have been saying. I can't really check that easily on PS5. If I had the PC version, I could. But it seems to be a UE5 conversion. But unlike Lollipop Chainsaw, they did not make sweeping changes to the graphics. It basically looks exactly the same, just in high res, with like new UI and stuff like that. So it looks like Unreal Engine 3, the game, quote unquote. You know what that means, of course, Alex. But on PS5, it runs a native 4K. And basically, anytime there's too many enemies on screen, or you go to that sort of like... the darker demon world when like the whole screen becomes blue and you're trying to get out and light the goat head to make it light again, the frame rate starts to drop. And I'm sorry, but a PS5 game that's an Unreal Engine 3 conversion with no real visual improvements should not be dropping below 60 frames per second. That is 100% unacceptable to me, especially when you're selling this as a remaster. To me, that's like you have done a bad job if that's happening. They have made choices on this game. It is native 4K with no anti-aliasing, by the way. So it's nice and crispy. But it turns out when you buy it on PS5, it includes the PS4 version. And if you load up the PS4 version, guess what, gentlemen?
That's better.
Lock 60.
It runs at a lock 60. I didn't actually pixel count this one. It is lower res for sure than native 4K, but like in this case, it's like, so what? Like, give me the 60 FPS locked over native 4K with no AA. It's just like it's slightly less sharp, but it runs correctly. And so, I can't believe we're here again, where it's like we have to rely on a PS4 version. And the reason we always laugh at this, Alex, and I think you can agree, is like what when you're in PS4 mode on a PS5, you technically have less hardware resources available than a native PS5 game would. Right. What this says to me is that this game can run easily at 60 frames per second, and the fact that it doesn't means the developers made choices that were bad.
Very bad.
That's literally it. They made a bad choice with the settings.
In this case, I'm really curious about what it is, because Unreal Engine 3 has been able to be like 4K 60 on GPUs since like.
Well, it's the Unreal Engine 5,
whatever.
I think.
Sorry.
It's that.
Whatever they did.
There's like an overhead to UE5.
Yeah,
right?
I guess so. But I'd be curious about what it
Annoyingly.
is, considering the graphics are so utterly
It's got to be
similar.
resolution, but I'm still don't get it. Why.
Yeah, it just shouldn't be that way. I mean, we know like the specs in the PS5 are fine for 4K 60 and Unreal Engine 3.
Right. The problem here, though, is that it drops far enough that it falls outside the VRR
Okay, that's
range.
even more
even.
pathetic, John.
Right? Like it almost goes down to like 30 FPS when you're in the demon world. It's that bad. Now, granted, so there's a couple interesting things. People playing on Xbox have said, "Well, I haven't had that problem," and that leads me to wonder either it's a works on my PC situation, or the Xbox version is flat out better. I actually don't know, because I don't want to buy it again to find out. I don't know how it is on PC. I assume Switch is going to be not great. I think it is on Switch. I'm pretty sure it is. But this seems to be the solution right now if you're on that. I guess the big question I have is, what happens if we run this on the PS5 Pro? Is it going to fix it?
It's just like fully
Guess
GPU
we'll find
limited
out in
for
like a
some
week or
odd
something.
reason.
Right. Like, will it just suddenly run
That'd be
perfect
funny.
then?
I
don't know
dropping
yet.
into the 30s.
It's
I'd be pressing X to down on that one. Maybe PS6.
So, it's cool that this game is back, but I'm sorry. Like, you can't release a remastered project like this and have these sorts of issues in there when they could have been fixed. I could have fixed this.
You probably could have.
We could have fixed this. I'm genuinely positive we could fix this. It's just, so like, did they just not see it? Did they not care? Like, this is not a budget thing. It's not like, oh, we got to ship. Like, this is like very little work to fix this.
John, I really wish I knew, but this is like one of those things where, when you're saying like a disaster remaster, what is the phraseology?
Disaster remaster.
The whole point of remastering a game is to get it in just a universally better shape. Like a DVD to Blu-ray release, it shouldn't be tampering with too much, but it shouldn't run worse. If the Blu-ray now ran at 20 FPS instead of 24 FPS, I'd be pissed, man. Yeah.
Right.
So
we just had this with Until Dawn.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Which actually did receive visual upgrades, but it still ran a lot worse than what was already out there. There was Lollipop Chainsaw as well. So I'm kind of cataloging all these so-called disaster remasters where you're just like, this probably shouldn't have been released like this, because this is just not very good.
Well, I'm looking forward to your catalog.
Yeah. We'll have to. That's the
We
thing.
could do a Kickstarter for it. It seems to be the vogue for these video game books at the moment.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about this then, Rich, another game came up, because a lot of people have been sending me videos of this saying, you've got to check out the Darksiders 2. I wanted to say remastered, but that's obviously Red Faction. It's
definitive.
But it's the
Definitive
re-release
edition,
of the definitive, right? This already existed.
It's the re-release of the definitive edition with ray tracing.
Yeah, you made an impassioned plea to the point where I did actually go to the PlayStation Store and buy it for you.
Yeah, so that may have been an error, sort of, and I'll explain. So what I quickly realized is that it does actually seem to run at 4K 60, or at least 60 FPS. I haven't actually pixel counted, but it runs well, actually. So I was like, wait, what the heck's going on here? Well, it turns out, from what I can tell, there seems to be a memory leak in the game. And at certain points, many users are encountering the scenario where the game suddenly drops into like the teens with full screen tearing. And it's basically barely playable at this point. And you essentially have to close the game and then reopen it to fix it. So it's not so much that it's just dropping randomly. It's just like there's clearly a bug in the game that's causing performance to sink. And I did not run into that bug in my testing. So it actually seems like an almost competent, good remaster, if not for that bug. And I hope they fix that, but it's still weird that they shipped it like that to begin with.
There's another side of this coin where they're releasing this update on PC as well, and it's currently, I think, in a beta branch version of the game. But it switches the game over to DX12 to take advantage of ray tracing. But as a result, they don't precompile any shaders, and the game is now now the game on PC has shader compilation stutter, which the older version didn't have. I think the older version is either D3D9 or D3D11. So yeah, I mean, we'll see how they fix that up because it's currently beta branch on Steam, and they did write a note I saw of them they're cognizant of the issue, but being cognizant of an issue and actually fixing it are two different things. So yeah,
very wow.
Okay.
Wow. So it is a disaster remaster
at that point.
then.
Yes, if it was on PC and it wasn't a beta branch, I would say yes, this is all.
Yes.
So a work in progress disaster that may actually have its issues resolved.
It could go either way.
Like this right now.
Okay, well, that was some bad news. Let's get that out of the way and move on. Okay, so we were going to discuss this last week, but we literally ran out of time. This week, we have some time. Recently, CitizenCon 2024, quote unquote, well, I was going to say dropped, but it happened. It happened. And there's YouTube evidence that suggests that it did happen. Alex has watched it. You're quite excited.
Yeah,
by it, right?
there's a lot of things that they showed off this year. Each year, this is just a little convention and or conference where the developers at Cloud Imperium Games present kind of like the future roadmap of what's going to be happening in Star Citizen, which is like the MMO portion of what Chris Roberts is doing there. And then the last 2 years, they've shown off stuff about Squadron 42, which was going to be imminent. Now it's a little bit less imminent, but it's still imminent, I guess. But on the Star Citizen side of things, they basically published the roadmap to 1.0, which is the reviewable, this game is out, and then you can play it with a lot of the game systems already in kind of thing. And on the tech side of it, not talking about gameplay stuff, they talked about how they're switching over to a new planetary tech system where the idea of the previous one was to flesh out like point of interests that are scattered across like a solar system, right? And in between that, there are artist designed kind of like biome sets that are then populating through the area, and the rules dictating that, like how they're populated, are not like physically accurate necessarily. And also they meant a lot of hardcore art time to get them working, and they wouldn't necessarily look like the team wanted them to look in terms of like physical plausibility of the environment, as well as a number of other things like pop in terms of terrain and trees. And last year they demoed a new water system, which was really cool, and that's in game right now. And based upon the principles of that, which is like virtualizing like a large like chunk of terrain and streaming in detail, they're applying a similar principle here to their latest version of planetary tech. And it like gets rid of all the terrain popping that you can see possibly. And they showed off a number of really cool new biomes that they're going to be debuting with it when 1.0 hits, including like crisis style jungles, which looked really awesome. They showed off swamplands as well too, which looked really, really good. And they had a whole lot of presentations covering what this all means. There was like an audio tech presentation about them adding in like Doppler to the game, and speed of sound kind of stuff to be more systemic. They also had a presentation there covering their progress into RTGI, which is apparently a huge undertaking for them because they've currently lit the game using like cube map probes and stuff like that, and then switching over all the game content to not be using that, but RTGI plus RT reflections is apparently a lot of work. because they've already arted the game in one way, including Squadron 42. So they showed off there basically that they have now a system for lighting and relighting particles, as well as volumetric fog using RTGI, as well as RT reflections for opaque surfaces now, covering the full range of reflectivity. So from 0 to 1, and not just like ultra hyper mirror reflections and stuff like that, which was great. But that was the one part of the presentation where I was like, I want to know more. What are you doing? But it was only like 10 minutes long. And a number of other things like that, basically showing off how they're going to make the game move over to its 1.0 state, which was really cool for those who are following Star Citizen. But for those who don't care about Star Citizen and just kind of want a new wing commander, I think John is right there. They showed off I don't even know how long it was. It must have been like an hour and 20-minute long prologue.
Yep. Hour 16 minutes.
Prologue of Squadron 42. It's the intro to the game, basically, before you actually join the crew on your Idris ship later after this. Like you start off first, I don't know, I think it's like a Hammerhead, some large capital ship sized thing. And there's a lot of interesting aspects of that I want to talk about. One, just to like get out of the way, it's actually not using the RTGI or RT reflections, which was noticeable on a lot of scenes actually. So it's obviously not using like the latest version of the tech that they have out there, but it was just whatever they polished up for the show. And it shows off a lot of interesting aspects of the Star engine at this point in time. They've been developing the game originally, like the original pitch was, it's going to be a lot more like a traditional styled game where there's hidden loading screens, kind of like Starfield, where you go from one area to the next and they maybe show like an animation of a ship moving, but it would just be like typical levels. And they scrapped all that years ago. And they said, no, we're going to use the tech we're developing for Star Citizen to make this game. And as a result of that, there's some pretty cool streaming and really large scale scene stuff going on that the tech from Star Citizen makes possible in a single player game, which I thought was really cool. Oh yeah, so this is a cool one. So at like 1612 in the video, they're referencing the planet below them, which is Vega. And they reference it, and then they immediately do a camera cut to planet side, and then they back up to the ships again, which is really cool. Obviously, so cool. That's not something you usually see in a lot of games, like just switching to like, you know, thousands of kilometers apart, and variety of density there too. They're completely different assets and whatnot. Another thing that was really cool is that like 3939, they show like the battlescape, and then the camera goes through the battlescape into the bridge of the Vendul Kingship there, and you can see it like transition into the ship bridge. And that's another thing that's like necessary for Star Citizen purposes, but not for a single player game, where basically the physical locations of the actual ships themselves, like there's actually a real bridge there. It's not like just some offhand scene somewhere else, but all the ships are made to be like a physical size where you can walk through them and, you know, be around them and make sense, instead of just being like an offhand thing they just developed for a cutscene. It's like, no, actually it zooms into the physical bridge of the ship, which I thought was really cool. Another cool thing that it shows off two versions of like similar tech that I'm talking about here, like this really quick streaming stuff, as well as something else, is that 42 minutes in, the character Admiral Bishop, played by Gary Oldman, says go, and it shows then a hologram of what is Squadron 42, these ships kind of decked out behind a series of asteroids, and it switches from the hologram view immediately to the real in-game view of those ships. And obviously that's streaming and stuff like that too, but the reason why they can show the hologram and the ships at the same time in the same physical locations is because Star Citizen and Squadron use like a really cool render to texture system where the entire game world can be pulled up on a hologram and simplified, essentially. So when they show the hologram, it's actually those ships in the game world with just a different camera on them with a different shader. So they can just switch, you know, really quickly. And it's actually like a really smart idea, instead of having to like manually make some holograms like that for an entire game that's going to be huge. So that was some cool stuff that I saw. And then we also got to see for the first time the push and pull system for zero G physics, where in Star Citizen, as is right now, you move around with like mini thrusters on your space gear. But for those moments when you don't have space gear attached that has thrusters, and specifically for Squadron, where you're not going to be in a spacesuit all the time that will have such things, they made a push and pull system, kind of like Dead Space 2's, or is it a little bit, where you'd move from like platform to platform by jumping. And they showed that off, I think, like at a little bit further into the trailer after like kind of all hell breaks loose and the ship detonates. It's like a zero G, it's like 60 minutes or something like that. Just some other really things that I thought were, before I get to critiques, things that I thought were really, really cool were the main menu is very old school PC game kind of thing, where it's like a 3D scene and you navigate it. They show that off in the beginning. It's like a series of bunk beds and a whole bunch of other stuff.
It's like TIE Fighter right there. It's the Wing Commander itself.
TIE Fighter. It's really cool. As well as when the Van Duel characters speak, I do enjoy the nice little UI that they do there, where it shows first the alien characters that then switch over to English language.
It's so cool.
Very cool stuff. But I got some critiques too.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I'm always that guy. I would say lighting is off, and I think that's mainly just from the game. First, this is not the RTGI. This is not RT Reflections. So there's a lot of like ugly cube maps in this trailer. If you look around for them, there's also some bad SSR. It's like really old CryEngine SSR at this point, because that is legacy. There's also, I think the biggest issue with the visuals in the trailer is the shadow maps. They are going wild. Like, these scenes are probably hundreds of kilometers across, not more, in these starscapes, and whatever they're doing for shadow maps at the current stage right here is not holding up. Like, there's huge shadow acne, there's large aliasing, there's disconnected objects because shadows are Peter panning, where the shadow doesn't connect with the actual object casting it due to just the cameras not being aligned with the geometry correctly at the viewing angle. And it's kind of sucks, because I think they're probably going to change that over time. But the ships and the characters and the scenes have so much geometric detail that it's actually getting lost in the lighting and the poor shadowing, which makes a lot of scenes look unstable visually. Another thing that I noticed is that the game has motion blur, and they've worked on this in the past, I know, but like something is a little off about it. The trailer was presented at 60 FPS with a lot of frame rate variability. But like sometimes it would seem like objects were moving in a direction and the motion blur was thinking it was moving perhaps at a different velocity. So like they would blur in a way that my mind's eye didn't expect. And maybe that just means like motion vectors aren't working or something else ain't right. It's kind of something that I criticized also like way back in the day. I think it was like when Avatar, they showed it off for the first time. Like the motion blur just didn't look right. It bothered me. Also, another thing is that depth of field is pretty good throughout the trailer, but there's a number of moments where like when it mixes with bloom on the sides of someone's face, like the bloom is blooming out against the side of someone's like paler face, for example, like Gillian Anderson's character. And there's like a rim light that is caught in the depth of field, so it looks like their face is haloed. Oh, yeah. That's a pretty typical depth of field issue. Not all games suffer from it always, and I don't know if it's like an art setup thing or if it's actually just something that is a necessary byproduct of keeping the depth of field performant. But it's something that happens in a couple scenes and takes away from like thinking like your brain goes immediately to, oh, this is like a cool CGI character, to like, oh, this is a video game. And that's one thing I thought about. But, you know, other than that, I thought it looked pretty awesome. I would have loved to have seen like more ship combat, but this is the prologue when you're not a pilot yet. So I can forgive it for that. But I thought it was pretty sweet.
Cool. I've just got one question, Alex. The road to 1.0, the roadmap, does it have any dates?
No. No.
Come on,
but Squadron now has a date. It's 2026. They actually say that at the end of the trailer.
Of course.
So that's the year after next. Of course it is. And but in terms of when I can cover Star Citizen again,
whoa, hold on a minute. You said imminent.
I said imminent, but not imminent. If you recall.
He has a concept of a release date.
Citizen. It's called Citizen COD, Rich, not Citizen Concept. But in terms of when I can cover Star Citizen again, which I've wanted to do for a while, is the next release is 4.0, which is, I guess, at the end of this year. And that includes server meshing. Wow. And Vulkan's been in the game for a while, but I've wanted to cover it again when server meshing's in. And that'll be the first public release of server meshing. So that'll be fun. I guess I would like to cover it then maybe in the new year based upon how much time we got.
Would you, though? Because we were expecting a Star Citizen video from you when the Vulcan render went in. That took years to arrive. Yeah. It arrived and you never did the video. There seems to be a kind of meshing of philosophies between you and the developer here, where, stuff happens.
Kick the can on down the road.
Promised.
It's
and it sort of arrives years on down the road.
Let me just say, it's hard to get away from things. Like, if I want to cover a game like this, like, I have to have like a lot of recordings and a lot of time, and maybe to show off things like multi-crew spaceships, I have to like write to people that play the game and say, like, would you spend some time recording with me? It's an endeavor. John knows that. Like, you have to plan a video about something and not just like show it off in a bad way, because that sucks.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. With that, let's move on. Okay, with news stories out of the way, it's time to move on to Supporter Q&A. This is the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters on Patreon to suggest topics and questions for inclusions in this week's Direct. I choose the ones which I think we can actually answer, for starters. That helps, doesn't it? And we're going to start off with this question from the Knight Who Says Ni! ! Gents! ! Earlier this generation, Digital Foundry suggested that a mid-generation refresh might not be necessary. Now that Sony has released the PlayStation 5 Professional, do you feel the same way? And do you think Microsoft might be regretting their choice not to release a Series S/X Elite Ultra Max Edition? This is an interesting question because we had pretty unanimous opinions on this, that a Pro console was not required. When the Pro console was revealed from Sony, we had a question that said, has Microsoft made a mistake by not producing a Pro console? And we said no. Mm-hmm. However, we have, actually, Alex, you haven't seen it yet, but John and I and most of the rest of the team have seen the PS5 Pro. I think answering this question, the key word that stands out to me is necessary. The PlayStation 5 Pro is not necessary. The standard PlayStation 5 is absolutely fine. But I do think it's a good thing. Now we've been hands-on. What do you think, John?
Exactly that. I would say our opinions really haven't shifted on this matter. I still think it's not that necessary, less so than the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. It's simply a nice to have thing, right? Where, like, once you actually see it, you're like, yeah, this is cool, this is nice, I would want this, but it's still, I don't think it's actually necessary. And that it's more like, in some cases, it's almost like hardware making up for faults in the software, which is not really a great thing. And I also still think that Microsoft is not regretting their choice, and I don't think it would have moved the needle at all for Xbox. Right. What they need is not more hardware. This is what I'm saying there. That's not the problems that they're facing, and I think they're going to change their direction anyway going forward to something very different. So it just doesn't make sense to follow Sony down this rabbit hole right now. And I think the PS5 Pro is going to be. I think Sony's been very clear about making it so that the PS5 does not seem like a second-class machine all of a sudden. It's like this is essentially another option for people that want a little more from it and are willing to spend for it. It is, I think, it's really just that kind of thing. It's for somebody that's very deep into the PlayStation and they want a better experience than they've already got. and they don't mind shelling out for it. And I think it's cool that such a thing exists, but by and large, it's probably not. It's not going to change that much about the generation, I think.
To echo what John said, I don't think it's necessary. Most technological things aren't. But I think also, like, it doesn't fulfill like a great niche, like John mentioned, with regards to PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, where the 4K sets came about, and just getting those things, Xbox One games, to look actually good on a 4K set was I would say, a big deal, and something really noticeable to even that casual observer. I don't think that's what PS5 Pro is about, and John really succinctly just said it. One thing that I would say that has probably changed, in my opinion, regarding it is originally from the AMD side of things, I was just like, I have no idea what they'd put in this box to make it like a worthwhile GPU upgrade, or even CPU upgrade, which is another thing, but I don't want to even talk about that right now. But I actually am very happy that Sony decided to make the biggest appeal is really like the machine learning super sampling, the PSSR. And I think that is a really like a way more interesting thing than just a bigger GPU or something like that. I think that is way more interesting. It's going to set the future for PS6, what they're going to be doing there, and maybe even beyond it. And I think that is way more interesting just from my tech head perspective about it, where I am actually now more interested in it than I would have been with like a theoretical, I don't know, like 2x GPU, but still runs FSR thing. Like I would just been like, okay. But I think that's way more interesting, and also just better for the ecosystem in general over time.
Yeah. My thoughts on this. Well, going back in the day when we were talking about the prospect of a Pro machine, and some of what we were talking about has come to pass. We thought it wouldn't be done because it would be too expensive, and lo and behold, we've got this $700 console, which scales up in cost. The further away from America you get, seemingly. That's been a problem. In terms of the market, though, well, what can I say? A minority of users will want a better experience and are willing to pay money for it. And that pretty much defines a stack of products in the CPU or graphics space. Yep. So Sony are basically adopting a similar strategy there. It's proven to work. You're not going to get gigantic, market-changing take-up from it, but they clearly think it's worth doing. And in terms of looking to the future of what a next-generation console is going to be, the idea that enhanced ray tracing capabilities and machine learning are now in a piece of hardware that's available to buy right now basically sets the stage for the generation to come. Right. And I think that's a pretty good thing to be doing. In terms of Microsoft, I agree with you. I don't think they're regretting their decision whatsoever, and it wouldn't have shifted the needle. I think what Xbox One X did was to restore a certain level of prestige to the Xbox brand. It was kind of needed at that point. Microsoft's strategy going forward is clearly, well, if you want performance, we support PC too. You can choose whatever parts you want. You can tailor your own experience. And, the versions of the games we're going to put out are going to tap into that hardware as well. It's just slightly difficult to communicate that to a kind of parochial Xbox versus PlayStation audience who are expecting Xbox to match Sony point for point. And, that's clearly not worked for them, and it's clearly not the strategy going forward. And, they own Windows. It's a pretty good place to start in terms of reshaping what Xbox is going to be. So, yeah, that's that. Let's move on. This question from GDP Rangers. Is it safe to assume that PlayStation 5 owners will overwhelmingly own 120 hertz TVs capable of VRR. I appreciate the same can't necessarily be said for the base machine, given it's marketed to all, but this is an enthusiast machine at £700, so I imagine most who buy it will have a TV at least as up to date as my LG C9. On that basis, could hashtag bespoke, hashtag professional 40 FPS modes taking advantage of PSSR, FSSR 3 frame gen, and already improved ray tracing capabilities and numbers of CUs lead to some truly full fat ray tracing spectacles? John, I don't think the actual balance of TV ownership is going to shift that much, to be honest. Possibly people who buy new technology are more likely to buy the Pro. Possibly.
Well, I think just by default that most, if you've bought a TV in the last like 5 or 6 years, it's probably going to have those features. At this point, it's pretty common now. And I would imagine that most people buying a PS5 Pro will probably have such a display. You basically have to cheap out to not get those features at this point. And like, I mean, like really, really, really cheap, like super low end, like the stuff you find like, yeah, in the back corner of a Walmart. That's kind of the kind of thing. Most people, I think, playing this probably aren't going to be using such a display. But then there's also plenty of people using PC monitors and the like, but it's really hard to know. And I don't know if there are any actual metrics available to Sony, if they can like tell like what the PS5s are connected to and then like take that data.
They have telemetry for sure.
Okay. I'd be curious to know on that.
Mm-hmm.
But that,
because remember back in the day, Cliffy B with Gears of War was talking about how he was shocked at how many people weren't even playing the game in HD 720p at that time.
That was a very different time though.
Absolutely, but the point is that the consoles are basically providing that telemetry to
the devs.
True.
Yeah, they're phoning home to Microsoft and Sony, so they will know what the split is.
Well, it's just I think we would expect that of Microsoft, but I wasn't sure if Sony had implemented, because they're a little bit behind on some of those types of things. But for better or for worse,
all about the data.
But they probably also have that data. You're right.
We'll probably see more modes, I suspect, but I don't think we'll see 120 FPS modes on Pro that won't be there on the base PlayStation 5.
I don't know. That seems like something that could conceivably happen, you know?
I was thinking more about the 40 FPS stuff.
Like an extra 40 FPS mode just for Pro. I would, that seems a bit niche, rather than just a mirroring of the mode that already exists, potentially. I understand that. Full fat ray tracing experience, I think, other than like F1, which we've seen, is probably the most ray traced game we've seen, possibly.
Doesn't Spider-Man also have a bunch of additional ray tracing features?
We haven't seen it yet though.
We haven't seen it yet,
so that's what I was talking about. In that case, I mean, I guess it depends. It's going to be a very per game thing and what developers do. Insomniac and the F1 people already have technology that they've developed that they're going to leverage then. But I don't know if many other than first party, even then it's kind of weird. Other than Insomniac, have any first party games even used a lot of ray tracing on PS5? I don't know.
First party?
Can't even think of anything right now.
Not much.
Yeah, no, obviously not, apparently.
Not really. Gran Turismo.
That's another one. Yeah, that's a good one. But they already had the tech developed, basically. They already had the tech developed, and then they can deploy it on PS5 Pro. But like a special, like they just developed purposeful ray tracing only for Pro. Currently, maybe not.
Like unlikely.
I don't know. I mean, looking at this, 120 hertz modes, yes, you could possibly have more of them on PlayStation 5 Pro, but ultimately you're still got the problem of the same CPU holding you back there. I do think that you could probably have a base PlayStation 5 and a Pro mode both running or targeting 120 hertz, especially once VRR is in contention there.
So it's not first party, and they've already done the work as well. But doesn't Alan Wake 2 only do ray tracing on Pro?
It does at 30 frames per second.
Right. So that is a case of getting ray tracing on the console where it's not on the base system.
Yeah,
but again, that's the ray tracing exists already. So
yeah, and there's enhancements with Hogwarts Legacy as well.
Right, that also has ray tracing, reflections and such. Yeah.
But it is, enhancements of existing modes. I think we're still going to see possibly you'll get pro-specific modes, but I still think there's going to be plenty of mode selections on the base PlayStation 5 as well. The extent to which they're actually game-changing on Pro, only time can tell, really. Right?
I take umbrage with this suggestion of 40 FPS modes taking advantage of FSSR3. Just the notion of a
rate of 20 frames per second.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm thinking. Which, no, thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this question from Peter. It's been coming up a lot on social media recently, and I think we need some clarification there. The question is this: the Series X has a small amount of ML hardware, just shy of 100 tops. Could this theoretically be used for image upscaling to provide a better result than FSR? Or is it not enough to work in a meaningful capacity? Now, the reason I'm raising this is because there's been some odd posts on social media. It's like, Sony is finally catching up to Microsoft because they're adding machine learning features. Xbox Series consoles have had it for the last 4 years. It's just nobody has used them. Now, Alex, can we clarify this situation?
I mean, there's an order of magnitude and difference in how much more capable the PS5 Pro is than an Xbox Series X or Series S for that matter. These 100 tops thing is in reference to Int 4, which is typically not what is used at all for machine learned upscaling. There is nothing preventing Microsoft from trying to make a machine learned model that fits and runs well on the Series X, but they haven't done it. So, they were not first to anything if it's not even used at all. It is like, has anything used it to our outward facing knowledge or inward facing knowledge at this point? No one has. It didn't amount to diddly squat at this point. So, I mean, I think an interesting use case for it would be running Auto SR for Xbox 360 backwards compatibility games. We've talked about this before on the show. Because they already made this Auto SR model that runs on MPUs that are like 40 Int 8 tops, right? And a GPU running it would incur less issues than an MPU off chip or using different like memory and cache. So I feel like there is a use case for it. It's just Microsoft has never shown interest in doing anything with it. So I would say no. There's nothing special Microsoft have done that Sony haven't already.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the series architecture was designed in 2016. So ML was on the radar, it was on the horizon, but the extent to how it would blow up 7-8 years later just wasn't really considered at that point. Anyway, let's move on. This question comes from Anxiously Chronoed Figured. Hi DF! COD Black Ops 6 seems to be quite a success with one of the best single-player campaigns in the franchise in years. And for most part, it looks really good too. I'm just disappointed it doesn't use any RT. Why do you think some studios abandon ray tracing in their newer releases, even if they already had it in some older games? It's not like fewer people have RT-capable cards. Cheers! Exclamation point. You raised this exact point on Twitter, I believe, Alex.
Just did.
I don't think Treyarch are actually using their own engine anymore.
Yeah.
I think they've moved on to the IW engine. So that's probably why IW doesn't have... Well, actually, it did have path tracing for the menus.
Right.
On one of the Modern Warfare games. But I think that's one of the reasons why. But it is a disappointment, isn't it?
I mean, I'd say it's a disappointment. It's pretty weird to see a regression in like a technological foundation The only time I can really ever think about it. Oh, sorry, I always beat up on this game, but Rage. I always think about id Tech. I always think about id Tech 5. It's like real time all the time, and then it's like nothing moves in Rage. It's incredible.
Google Maps.
That is the last time I think about that. But ray tracing, I think it could help some of the aspects of the visuals in this game. There's a lot of reasons why devs wouldn't do it. One of the reasons why they talked about it with regards to the Treyarch engine, which they're apparently not using anymore, so that would be a big reason why. But they had to go and create systems that the art wouldn't break down in scenes that were originally artistically developed without ray trace shadows in mind, and then they'd go into the scene and just add the ray trace shadow with the same light, and they realized the artists were doing things to make the shadow map look fine that would change the artistic representation of the scene if it actually had physically plausible shadows at that point. So they talked about that presentation they did a number of years ago. Like, so the art setup time to do it may be something they didn't think of wanting to invest in, because it would cause headaches and money and all these things for maybe minimal return. But I also think targeting last gen consoles constantly, like this series has done, is probably a detriment for the resources that they can spend on other things, engineering time. So that's another thing I would say. Also, this is an AMD sponsored title. AMD hasn't added really good ray tracing to any game that they've sponsored. So that's another thing to consider. Last titles, I think, with the weird path traced menus, were NVIDIA sponsored, to my knowledge. But the tech is there, apparently. They do have the ability to path trace stuff, apparently.
Well, have you considered this, Alex, that maybe this game supports ray tracing? It's just that we can't find it in the menu.
This is true. Yeah, that is a menu, John. That is quite
I
the
mean,
menu.
when you get into that UI, it's like that. I would not put it above them that there's ray tracing somewhere in there, and we've just never found it.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's move on. This question from Octalima. Why do you think interlace/checkerboard rendering has all but disappeared from modern games? Capcom, Guerrilla and FromSoft prove it can be quite effective at resolving near-native image quality. I haven't seen any games that make use of reconstruction on top of single-axis resolution scaling of any kind, but I would assume it could produce quite a competent image. What gives? Where's the checkerboarding gone, Alex?
Where's all the checkerboarding gone?
Still here.
It's occasionally there.
Occasionally
Horizon.
here.
It's in the Capcom games.
Horizon uses it.
Horizon.
Maybe it's been in a handful of Frostbite titles before they moved to FSR.
Oh, right.
They dumped it in God of War, interestingly. God of War Ragnarok did not use checkerboarding anymore. I think the reason why people don't use checkerboarding is because it requires the game to render essentially an image with holes, which has so many knock-on effects of, well, okay, then how do we do post-processing now? How do we converge the image on the end to look good for all these different elements? And I think that was getting checkerboarding into an engine was a lot harder than just rendering at a lower resolution and allowing TAA to bring it up. A lot harder. And I think that is the main reason why.
Yep.
Just took more time and effort to get a good image, oddly.
Do you remember the geometry upscaling stuff from the PS4 Pro?
Yes. Yeah, that was great.
That is weird looking stuff.
Awesome.
Actually, if you go back and look at it, it does look
so
really
weird. It's so weird.
I don't know if I agree with that usage.
Resogun was checkerboarded but had native geometry. That was quite interesting. It did look really, really good, though. That's a pretty good one, though. But yeah, I think generally speaking, it's just that times have moved on. Technologies have emerged that are just easier to use and better. And so the era of the checkerboard is slowly but surely coming to an end. But there did seem to be like a bit of a drop-off point post PlayStation 4 Pro, where even, developers like Insomniac were just not using the onboard checkerboarding hardware because they had their own temporal injection system that just kind of looked better, I guess. So yeah, it's just the progression of technologies there. Okay, let's move on. This question from Dr. Delectable. Hey team, exclamation point. I saw John was added to the contributor list for the EGM Compendium that is currently blowing up on Kickstarter, not literally. Would any of you be willing to share some of your memories of EGM, or other gaming magazines in general? And if John is able to, let us know what his possible contributions might be to the EGM Compendium. Thanks, double exclamation point. John.
Yeah. I mean, I assume you guys haven't actually seen this then? It's a book being funded over on Kickstarter. It's doing, good Lord, they're doing well.
I've seen the Kickstarter, but I'm curious what your involvement is with it.
Oh, I just asked to write some pieces for it, basically on, my thoughts and feelings on that. Cause I obviously have a history with reading EGM actually, and being quite a fan of it back in the day. I mean, you being in the UK, I guess it would have not had I mean, you were basically a competing magazine anyway.
That's amazing.
Really. Well, but in the UK. So.
Well, I'll come to my involvement with EGM shortly, but Alex, do you have any particular magazine stories involving EGM?
I honestly can't remember. I'm feeling really old all of a sudden, where I was trying to imagine the last time I got a magazine. And it was here when Crisis 2 hadn't come out yet.
Okay.
PC Games Hardware had a exclusive look at it. And I remember being disappointed when they said the game was going to be DX9 on release in this interview. And I was like, Jesus Christ. I definitely remember that.
Checks
they
out.
were like describing how realistic the textures looked, but they didn't have parallax mapping. And I was like, what is going on with Crysis 2? But I actually don't remember a lot of other magazine stuff because it was like really far away in my memory at this point, actually. Sorry.
So EGM specifically, console orientated, weren't that interested?
I got nothing in my brain right now. Sorry. Did they do the Halo 2 blowout back in the day? Was that EGM?
Oh, EGM had a big Halo 2 story for sure.
Where they showed off like the various Warthog variants. Is that EGM? Sorry, someone in the audience correct me there. But I definitely remember looking at that. But I remember that.
Well, my EGM story is that in 2004, I did all of their cover DVDs. Mm-hmm. They had a DVD run, which was quite interesting.
I didn't actually realize that. That's cool.
The very, very early days of Digital Foundry where we made DVDs, and that's what we did. Yeah, it was pretty cool. And it had also like a CD-ROM section on it. I can't remember exactly what was on that. I think I did a couple of discs for their PC magazine that they were running simultaneously at the time, the name of which escapes me. But what can I say? I'm really excited to see what this EGM Kickstarter is all about. Maybe we should do something similar for Meme Machines. That'd be quite fun.
I think that would be cool.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. This next question comes from Chem. Could be Chem, actually. Hi, with Capcom announcing over 50% of their games having sold on PC this year, what are possible changes or trends you think will result from this? I know Alex has been vocal about day and date releases, but could more publishers shift to a more PC-focused approach? Looking forward to hearing your opinions. Thanks. What do you think about this, Alex? Do you think more people will be shifting to a day and date approach?
A lot of games are day and date. A whole lot of them are. It's just the rare like Sony stuff or the money-hatted games that we've talked about in the past before. I mean, I guess the industry trend for a while has been moving in this PC direction. From all publishers, Sony included. And then I don't know, with Capcom, they're interesting because internally and externally to their investors, they said like they're always like pushing like to be like the PC native version and like pushing the PC, but some of the like the execution has been faulty at times. And I think that applies to a lot of companies where it seems like they are PC first, but then the execution is faulty. And that's probably has nothing to do with the aims of being PC first. It's more like these project goals are just ridiculous to get a game out and actually polish it in a good way. A lot of games just don't come out polished. So, I would love to see more in it, but I'm not like the person's describing this as like I require day and date, and I would disagree with that. I do not necessarily require day and date. It's nicer, but I really just want a PC version that's good at the end of the day. And if that means a 3 to 6 month wait, I'm totally fine with that. I don't think it's necessary to be hyped up day one and playing the game.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, John? I think, based on what I'm hearing, there is definitely a movement to expand audiences, right? To sort of reach out from beyond the 2 to 250 million people that have consoles. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there's a lot of data that we're starting to hear now that the younger audiences are just, teenagers, for example, are kind of more interested in mobile and PC as opposed to consoles.
Yep.
So, it just kind of makes sense that PC is probably going to become more important.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. I think PC is just becoming more important because that's just more people are using them every day. And it's just, like I said, the younger generation, they're coming up. PC is a huge deal to them. I think the only console platform that really has managed to still capture younger audiences is Nintendo.
Right. Yeah.
And I think they'll continue doing what they do. I don't expect Nintendo will dip into the PC world anytime soon, but just about any other publisher is, very likely to continue or increase their PC plans.
I mean, that brings us back to the whole execution thing, though, Alex, where, it's become a bit of a sad joke at just how bad some PC games are at launch. Mm-hmm. And it's basically a lottery as to whether they'll be fixed or not. If you're going to be looking towards the future with, an increased reach from PC, this whole emphasis on, launch now, fixed later, possibly has got to change.
Yes. I mean, I think because the word of mouth on PC is extremely strong because people read a post on Reddit and it's on the device they play on. Or they read the Steam forum and it's literally on the device they play on. So they just don't go to the Steam store and buy your game at that point. It's pretty hardcore. Unlike, I would say, the more, it's not as direct and not as extreme on the console side, I would say. And I think that needs to change because word of mouth is everything. And actually the good reputation you get from having a good PC version day one is usually very high, and it's hard to recover reputation over time. Only a few big success stories in the last years, like Cyberpunk is one of them. No Man's Sky is one of them. But most people, they write something off, they write it off for good. So first impressions are everything.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's move on to the final question. This one's from I Like Licorice.
Me too.
ADF ! Knowing how creative Nintendo can be when utilizing hardware when it releases, and assuming that Switch 2 is ray tracing capable, can we expect revolutionary use of RT? Ooh. A dungeon in a new Zelda game built fully around light and shadows? Metroid 5 in fully dark areas lit up only by Samus's suit? Assuming that the Switch 2 has the same form factor as Switch, what creative use tech would you like to see from Nintendo? Thanks! ! This is an interesting question, Alex, because fundamentally they have got all of the features required for next generation gaming. It's just really the performance that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think also Nintendo's art style lends itself well, like the usual art style you find in a lot of their platform games, for example, lends itself to a variety of types of ray tracing. And it would be interesting because of all of the people who make games currently, I would say Nintendo would be the one to do something really interesting with it. Mm-hmm. Just kind of like how the Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom games they use systemic physics in a way that AAA games don't tend to do. And I would say they would do the same thing here. I can't even begin to dream of what they would dream of, But I do think like a game like Luigi's Mansion, you could see them doing it, right? That game, they already had the mirror in Mario 64, right? Like what they can surely do some fun stuff like that with mirrors, and you could only do that also without ray tracing, technically, if it's just a mirror on a flat surface. But they would actually do it probably with a gameplay purpose in mind. I don't know, John, do you think of anything?
I mean, it's just as you say. I mean, there is a good chance that they could do that because they have done this in the past. Like sometimes it's successful, sometimes not, but it takes me back to like, I mean, from things like when they did the Game Boy Color version of Zelda Link's Awakening, they made a dungeon based on color, right? They've always done games that utilize specific hardware features of their controllers. It's very Nintendo to utilize hardware in interesting ways to do fun things, because they're only fundamentally targeting that singular platform, so they can kind of do whatever they want with it. So I could see them doing something fun with ray tracing in one of their games. If their engineers get a hold of this, like, hey, we can do this thing, and suddenly it's like, well, how about we do this like sort of puzzle or a concept idea here using those features. So I'd like to see it. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, the Switch 2 is just so forward-looking in so many ways. It's just a question of how much you could get out of like a device that likely has to run the SoC at like 5 watts mobile.
It's always the question, man. I'm really interested to see what that ends up looking like in terms of like power and just what they actually push on the mobile form factor here.
I mean, what I will say, though, is that, integrating stuff like machine learning and ray tracing onto the silicon is not cheap, right? It all takes up die area, and area is like, at a premium, especially now. So for Nintendo to embrace that, there has to be a reason. DLSS is an obvious one, right? Ray tracing, it's down to them to see what they can do with the hardware, but it's there for a reason. And, it's not as if NVIDIA can't produce cut down versions of hardware with the RT cores removed, because we saw it with the 16 series on GTX. So they can do it. Anyway, that was the last question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you did enjoy it. Ring bells for notifications that may or may not appear. Store.digitalfoundry.net to partake in our merchandising wares and support the team in that way. DF Supporter Program itself, join us for early access to DF Direct Weekly, a chance to help shape the show. Bonus materials, lots going on there. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.